Right here is some great information about KSP2, hot from the heels of creative director Nate Simpson. The details come from a recent AMA and discuss many future elements of the game, including colonies, interstellar travel, and more. Now, the full AMA is available on Reddit. You can see that linked in the video description. But meanwhile, I will talk about some of the best highlights right here. So let's start with the first question, which really stood out to me, which was, how has the rough launch of Early Access affected the overall mood and productivity of team members and developers? So Nate was pretty straight to the point here, and he seems fairly unfazed by the overall rough launch. He said, "Can't answer for the older team, but will give you my personal answer. We're feeling good. We're playing the game and having fun while squashing bugs. Been great seeing the community get their hands on the game and enjoying it. Feels really great to fix a bug, almost like scratching an itch." Mean comments are kind of something that just comes with game development, but with the KSP community, the negative comments come from a place of care, not hair. I assume that means hate. Overall, feeling very good. So personally, I feel this is a decent response. I do understand that some people are going to feel it's somewhat dismissive towards all the problems that are out there. The thing is, this is an early access game. But, that said, as I've said in the past, and as many other people have said in the past, it seems somewhat early access. It could have been a bit better than its current state. But that said, the fact that the team are generally looking forwards rather than backwards is a really good sign, because it does mean that a lot of development and a lot of progress is going to go into KSP2, and they are going to get it into a good place. I think that's very apparent every time you hear the developers speak, so I don't really have any concerns with that. Moving on, the next question I'd like to read about here was, can you give any more detail about the automated trade routes and how they're going to work? So these things are in regards to colonies. When you set up a colony, and colonies will essentially need resources, you will be able to set up automated trade routes to deliver said resources to these colonies or between colonies. So for this, Nate said, big question. Maybe it's helpful to give some context about iterative development. When we create a spec, our focus is to improve things in parallel. For delivery routes, we have clear steps. The first implementation is crediting and debiting resources to vehicles and colonies based upon duration. Second implementation might take into account launch windows and such, and someday it'll be very cool to see vehicles coming and going, but not a promise. So a fairly vague statement there, not going into too much detail, and to be perfectly honest, I don't really remember or recall what the development team have spoken about regarding this in the past. But fortunately, this was something I did get the opportunity to discuss with Nate himself when I was over in Amsterdam during the preview event, and I actually asked him about this question. And he said at the time, and keep in mind this was just a discussion, a sort of interview with him, but whether or not this goes into the game we'll have to wait and see, but he said their current thoughts were that players would first set up a route themselves. So, for example, you would take a journey from A to B and find the resources you need at B and then move them to destination C. Once you've completed that route successfully, you'll then be able to get the game to automate that same route. Now, combining that with what we've heard Nate say in the AMA here, it seems there may be some type of hybrid information going on, so you won't actually see the route being automated, not physically. You won't see ships or vehicles, cars moving from A to B, but rather it will be a simple case of that data being recorded and then automated in terms of crediting and debiting the resources that could be made along that trip. So it should be pretty interesting to see, especially with multiple colonies. It's going to be very interesting to see how big and how vast empires can be built. So moving on, can we get anything in writing related to the planned structure and function of multiplayer within the game, and how you plan to work around certain speed bumps like time warp? So Nate said, generally we try not to talk much about multiplayer, but let me give you something. People will have separate timelines, and then there will be a reconciliation phase when players interact with each other. That's the plan right now, but I can't speak directly to the details of this feature. Future comms coming. So this is a really interesting point, because it's something I've been wondering about. I know a lot of other people have. how do you actually make a time warp work in a multiplayer environment? It seems, reading between the lines, what they're saying here is that within multiplayer you'll have independent play sessions, so players who want to time warp independently from each other will be able to do that. They'll effectively move into a I assume, a single player session, which will then reconciliate with the other players at a future point in time. Very keen to see how that actually works in practice. The next question is about wobbly rockets. This has certainly been a big problem since early access and with patch 1 as well. Are there any plans to make this feature more detrimental to rocket design and progression, or is this simply an early implementation of something that will become more elaborate and significant? So Nate says, this is a really good example of how having something in early access helps us iterate and develop features. He went on to say this is a hot topic, so here's his 2 cents. If a rocket is skinny and made of many stacked parts, it should wobble. Larger scales, no. So larger ships basically that are stacked shouldn't wobble. So he says they're working on it and it will get better than the current implementation. Would resources needed for colony construction be planet and biome specific? So this is again a really interesting question because colonies are definitely going to be a big part of the game going forward. To this, Nate answered, the diversity of resources is what's going to make exploration mode so fun. Compared to KSP1, which was very self-directed, taking temperatures for example, players essentially, I think he's getting at here, would choose their own missions and their own objectives for exploration. But he goes on to say, when there is a unique resource somewhere that gates your access to some category of parts or features, well, it totally changes the game. It gives you something material, literally material, yet the interplanetary interstellar progression will really pop once you're able to dig up specific things that gives you a specific ability. So very much sounds like there's going to be a lot of unlocks along the way, something that's certainly in KSP1 when it comes to science, but well, it'll expand that sort of gameplay out to more physicalized type of gameplay where you actually have to go out and physically explore and locate various things. Looking forward to that. The next question, when Interstellar is implemented, are the different solar systems going to be stationary or are they going to move? So Nate gave a bit of a scientific explanation here, saying that essentially this stuff is very difficult to work out. In essence, it's unpredictable because you're dealing with things such as dark matter. But yes, they do want to have movable star systems so that you'll have to intercept with this star that you're heading towards. Now, we mentioned science just a moment ago, but science again comes up right here. Are there going to be any significant changes to the science system in KSP2, or any changes that you feel are worth talking about? So, here Nate says, for context, the first part of progression modes that will be coming in a roadmap update will be a science mode. It will be similar to the KSP1 experience, gaining science points and redeeming them for parts. Differences would include, we don't want people to be able to gather huge amounts of science around the Kerbal Space Center. We want to push people to explore and visit all the other celestial bodies. There will be an opt-in mission system that gives you a reward for doing a particular thing. Another question on colonization. For the far-off colonization update, how will buildings work? Will we assemble them ourselves by landing modules and moving them into position, or will it be more like a prefabricated type of building system? So the answer to this is that they have an inflatable module that you can put on a vehicle, and once you deploy it, it's basically like setting up a campsite. It sets up a VAB-like interface. Using that and other modules, you can use resources to add even more modules to the colonies. There will be attached nodes, and it'll be very similar to creating a vehicle. Also, the same thing applies to orbital colonies. And interestingly, there is another question on orbital colonies. It goes, orbital colonies have been mentioned. Will they have a set orbit once the first part has been built, or will they be able to move with engines like other spacecraft? The short answer here is that yes, they can be moved and they can be crashed. He also went on to say that orbital colonies are completely critical to the interstellar progression, and that you won't be able to make an interstellar vehicle in a gravity well, although it does note that someone over time will probably prove him wrong on that one. Elsewhere in the AMA, there's mentions of asteroids going to be making a return. They say that artists have already made the assets, it's just a case of including them when the schedule permits. Robotics, will they be implemented in a future update? They say probably not before version 1.0, so that's the full release of the game. Robotics will probably come sometime after that. Will we be able to terraform planets? Nope. Straightforward no there. Any thoughts on adding VR support to KSP2 in the future? Nate says that yes, he badly wants it, but the conversation won't happen until after version 1. Another thing here is the re-entry effects. We have seen some preview images of the re-entry effects coming up in a future patch. You can see a screenshot of that right here. This is not re-entry, this is leaving the atmosphere, but it's still the heating effects. The question is asking, will the coloration of these re-entry effects be different from planet to planet, basically due to the chemical compositions of the atmosphere? To this, Nate said that different atmospheres probably have different colours of plasmas, different ionisation attributes. Going back to that iterative development point, the first version of re-entry heating will be one single colour, but the spec definitely calls for multiple colours based on location and atmospheric composition, so sounds like something for the further in the future. And finally, once the game is complete, with everything on the roadmap implemented and debugged, is it possible development will continue with new features? And to this, the answer is KSP got updates for over a decade. We want to do the same thing. So there we have it, some really interesting information there. Do let me know in the comment section below which parts stood out for you. The full AMA is linked in the video description. Do check that out if you want to see it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.